The Queen's Jewish Link presents the Jewish Living Podcast, the show that examines the many facets of Orthodox Jewish life. Here's your host, Izzo Zwirin.
For the last year and a half, the world has been at the mercy of a global pandemic. I know, newsflash, right? But as we seem to be on the way out of it, we should all be aware that there will need to be an adjustment period where people will have to get back into the swing of regular life. Nowhere is this more relevant than in schools. Throughout the pandemic, students and teachers were required to participate in remote school, socially distance in the classroom and at recess, wear masks all day, or any combination of all of these. As these barriers come down, many students will have to readjust, and some may have to learn a whole new set of rules altogether. That's why we invited on this week's guest.
Hi, my name is Chesky Gewirtz, and I am a psychologist. I am the clinical director at New York City Health and Hospitals, Queens. I'm the director of the Child and Adolescent Clinic, and I also work in private practice in West Hempstead and in Cedarhurst.
I'll be asking Chesky a slew of questions revolving around how teachers, parents, and students should approach life after the pandemic. Well, Chesky, thank you so much for joining me this week. So I want to get a little bit of a background on you. You basically gave me your entire credential list in the beginning, but if you want to give me a little bit of background on your profession, on why you got into this field, and where you are now.
Sure. So as a clinical psychologist, most clinical psychologists complete PsyDs or PhDs. So I completed a PsyD, which is a doctorate in clinical psychology at Yeshiva University at Furkov. And the reason why I went into psychology was because I've always been fascinated by the complexity of human beings, and I've always liked listening to people, and I kind of prided myself as being a good listener. And the field of psychology, really brings together that curiosity about people and the ability to listen and help the person in front of you get to know themselves better.
All right. So the reason that we brought you here today is to discuss the end of hopefully the end of the pandemic and what returning to classrooms will be like for children. And I'm glad that you agreed to come on and talk about this. This is not an easy topic. It's not, controversial, but it's something that, everybody's going to be going through sooner or later. And some people have already started going through it. And I appreciate you taking the time. So what I want to take a little bit of time doing is talking about each individual age bracket and talk about how coming out of schools are going to affect them the most. I want to start what I perceive, and maybe I'm wrong, and that's why I have you here, to be the probable most affected by coming out, and that's the elementary school age. Kids that when they were last not in a pandemic were very young, maybe first grade or younger, and they spent a year at least within a pandemic situation, and maybe now they're in first, second, third grade, and they'd never really had a classroom experience. So firstly, I'm going to ask you a wide range of stuff, and you can attack this any way you want, but kids might not be used to having a teacher without a mask. Kids might not be used to having a classroom with a full range of functionality. They might have been required to sit in a specific area and not explore the room. And that could lead to social issues, meaning kids not used to being able to talk to other students, maybe even without a mask, and potential behavioral classroom issues. So any of those, if you want to attack any of those.
Yeah, so I think this is obviously a really important topic, and as you said, hopefully we're on the other side of the pandemic, and hopefully we'll have the kids be going back to school relatively normally, but I guess we'll have to see how things pan out in that regard. But in terms of the adjustment, so I think regardless of whether this is their first time that they're going to be in a classroom because they're young, or whether they just, were in a classroom beforehand and now it's adjusting to going back. I think whenever we think of adjustments and changes, we have to think of the developmental stage that the child's at. So I think you're correct in pointing out that it depends, the younger kids will have different challenges than the middle school, than the high school students. So I think when we think about adjusting, we often think about anxiety and avoidance. And what I mean by that is someone who is more prone to have anxiety or tend to be nervous about things, any change, any adjustment is going to bring up avoiding. They're going to want to avoid. They're not going to want to actually embrace that change.
Sounds like adults also.
Correct, exactly. This is kind of like the frame of anxiety in general.
Yeah.
But especially during this time and throughout the pandemic and now in this somewhat post-pandemic era, there's just a heightened anxiety in general. There's heightened fears of what's going to be, and anxiety and uncertainty also go hand in hand.
Right.
And when you have so much uncertainty, and that's uncertainty on a global sense of what's happening in the world and what's going to be with the status of the world, but more on a micro level, the uncertainty that a child feels of what's this going to be like, either because they've never been there before or
right.
because there are just so many changes of what was, and now they have to get back to something new. So that itself is going to bring with it, pushback. It's going to bring with it avoidance. So we could, kind of go through each stage one at a time, if that would be helpful. I think that, the elementary school, as you said, could be a specific challenge in the sense of, they're not used to the whole school setting to begin with, which on the one hand, that could make it easier because everything's new regardless.
Right.
On the other hand, it could make it challenging because there's so many new things being thrown at them at once.
Right.
So I think depending on the child, obviously you have to know how to address it. I think general rules are the more predictability and structure you could provide, the easier the transition will actually be. So, as I was saying before, uncertainty goes along with anxiety and avoidance. So the more certainty, not that we could tell a child exactly what something's going to be like, but through preparation, through giving them predictability and structure, that really goes a very long way.
Now, is that a school responsibility or is that a parental responsibility?
So I think both. I think definitely from a parental perspective, parents can do whatever they can to create structure at home. And by structure, I mean specific schedules, routines. And when it comes to, this is a little bit of a different topic, but when it comes to discipline and, trying to get children to do what the parents expect, there should be predictability and consequences, that a child should know. If they do A, they'll receive B. If they don't do X, then they won't get Y, etc. So I think predictability in terms of schedule and in terms of structuring, behavior modification and, praise and punishments, consequences, etc. I think that's very important from the parent's perspective. And from the school, I think, the same thing holds true. The more that the child knows what the routine is, and I think recognizing that there will be an adjustment at first, so there will be, a period where there will be pushback, and the kids aren't going to want to necessarily jump in to the new circumstances. I think patience is really important too.
All right, so we sort of covered elementary school. We didn't really dig in deep. I want to bring up some issues that might be for older kids, and then maybe we can come back to elementary school kids if we decide. So middle school kids probably more likely to have participated in some sort of a hybrid model of learning, some days in the classroom, some days outside. High school students probably also dealt with that. High school students might have just had fully outside of the classroom. So those kids are coming into a situation where they had a different set of learning circumstances, especially the ones that were completely remote. Now, some of the kids that are completely remote might have excelled even more during COVID because they preferred that model. So first of all, for those kids that were doing very well on a distance model of learning and now have to readjust to regular classroom life, what is something that we should be aware of for those kids?
Right. So I think in general, if kids were doing well or even better, with the remote learning, it probably has something to do with the fact that there's some issue that gets in the way of being in the classroom and going to school every day. So, for example, a lot of the kids that I work with had somewhat of a relief. It's hard to say that, but during the pandemic when they had their remote learning, because they didn't have to deal with the social challenges of school, they didn't have to deal with maybe separating from parents, separating from the home environment. So I think that the kids that probably have the most challenges going back to school in this age group that we're talking about, it's probably because of more the social emotional aspects, probably less so the academic. It's hard, at least for me, to imagine that academically there was some benefit from the strict didactic perspective of having to do remote learning. I think that most kids would tell you, and I think parents and teachers would tell you that kids became, I just heard this term today on the radio, zombies, like as opposed to zombies. So I think there's a certain fatigue that comes with having to look at a screen from a learning perspective.
Right.
So I think the challenges are probably more social emotional, and I think that has to be addressed with the guidance counselors and with the teachers, of course, being aware of those difficult adjustments and helping support the child.
Do you think that one thing that might grow out of this is a fully remote school that is fully remote all the time, and B, if that's a good idea?
So I'll start with B. I personally think that's probably not a good idea. I think there are so many developmental milestones and challenges that children face that are helpful for their development. And I think a fully remote school is not allowing for those full experiences, social, emotional. I mean, there are plenty of kids, historically, who get homeschooled, and they don't necessarily have those exposures, and maybe they turn out fine. So I don't think there's one cookie cutter blanket answer for everyone, but I would say in general, it probably is to the child's detriment if they're not getting that real life experience.
Now, do you think that despite what you believe that maybe not such a good idea, that it might happen? And I'll go a step further. And if it does, and a parent sees that their child might benefit from it, what's something that they can do to mitigate against some of the issues that you pointed out?
So, I mean, I'm not engrossed enough in the world of education. I mean, obviously, I work a lot with kids. I work with schools. The clinic, which I direct, has actually 3 school-based clinics that are in Queens Public Schools. But that being said, I'm not enough entrenched in the academic world to know if that's something that people are actually planning and thinking about. If it were to happen, I would say, first of all, obviously for the younger kids, someone would have to be home with the kid, I think, to ensure that it works. I think it really takes a certain kid with certain skill sets to be able to be self-disciplined, to be on the Zoom the whole time, to be able to complete the work, to not be playing Roblox while they're on the Zoom. So I think it's important for there to definitely be supervision if that were to be the case. And I think to answer your question of how to compensate for what might be lacking, I think it'll be even more important to make sure they're involved in some other social, extracurricular activities, clubs, teams outside of the school context.
All right, so let's move on to extracurriculars, since you just brought it up. Even kids that are going back into the classroom, they probably missed a year plus of extracurriculars. Could we see any residual effects on extracurriculars based on the fact that they've been missing for the last year?
Well, I think, one thing that definitely comes to mind when you ask that question is the increase in the use of, digital devices, which unfortunately I believe have taken the place throughout the pandemic. I think now we're seeing, thankfully, kids going to camp and getting involved with, things again. But I think that there's been a real, pandemic within the pandemic of addiction. And I don't use that word lightly, but because I see it so frequently, there really is, on a biological level, a addiction to devices. And I think that it's been increasingly difficult for parents to get kids away from devices and, get out and, do karate or get out and do gymnastics, whatever the extracurricular is. But I think that just makes it even more important that parents are aware of the importance and being firm. Obviously you have to have the resources to do some of these things, but assuming that it's available, to really get the kids out there.
By the way, that is probably not exclusive to children being more, zombified by their electronics. That's probably a parent thing too.
100%.
I could speak from personal experience.
No,
it's probably the case. If my wife listens to this, she'll be like, "See, even you know it."
No, but I think the point is, of course, very, very well taken, and I think it gets to the modeling effect. And the more that children see their parents on devices, and this could be a whole other talk, but that has a huge impact on the kids' use. And sometimes it's even important, just like a small idea would be if a parent is on a device and the kid sees, it's important, and the parent is doing something that's work related or something that's not just mindlessly scrolling through Instagram or something. I think it's important for the child to hear, daddy's actually doing work right now. So not that that's going to change everything, but I think that the modeling is so powerful. So anything we could do to mitigate that is helpful.
So let's go back a little bit into the actual classroom. Kids were sitting at home. If they needed a break, could literally just put mute, turn off the camera, walk to the bathroom, take a break. A lot of other things, if they needed to zone out, easy to zone out, hard for the teacher to bring them back. I know some teachers were probably superhuman and able to do that, but a lot weren't, and it's not their fault. It's just this is what we were stuck with for a year. Kids going back now don't have that luxury, I'll put luxury in scare quotes, of being able to just take a break for an extended period of time, miss a class without too much ramifications. Now that they're not going to be able to do that, is that something that kids, how to prepare kids for that, and how do schools get ready for this possibility of kids just needing more time because that's what they were used to?
It's a great question. I think a number of layers to that. So I think number one is alluding to what I was saying before. I think patience in general is very important on every level. I think teachers have to be patient with themselves, with their students. Students have to be patient with themselves. Parents have to be patient with the students. What I'm trying to say is that adjustments take time, and I think we live in a culture, perhaps, that everyone wants to just have everything work out well very quickly. And sometimes we're very quick to act and make changes, and maybe this isn't the right fit for the kid, etc., before allowing things to play out in a patient manner. So I think that's like a number one rule, I would say, for everyone, for all of us at all levels, to be patient with the transition. I think in terms of kids that have a hard time sitting still, I think this was an issue even before Zoom, obviously, but I think that teachers have to understand every child is different, and certain children need that break, and some kids have that on their IEP, on their individualized educational plan, or on their 504 plan, that they are allowed to take breaks. And we are seeing a higher rate of diagnoses of ADHD, anxiety for kids. So I think it is important for teachers to be aware of that if there is a deficit, to allow for that space. But it sounds like you were asking, even if there's no, official diagnosis,
Right.
they're not meeting criteria, just a kid who was just used to it,
Yeah.
from Zoom. I think the same thing should probably apply. You don't have to have a diagnosis of ADHD to have difficulty, sitting still, for extended amounts of time, especially coming off of, Zoom learning. So I think it's important for there to really be a paradigm shift, amongst the schools, amongst the teachers, parents, etc., that things are different, and maybe we could learn from some of these, challenges that came up, throughout the pandemic and that are continuing to come up. Maybe we could make some more adjustments in school and some more flexibility, that not every kid is going to fit into that, cookie cutter.
So it's funny how you mentioned right in the beginning of that it's going to take an adjustment. It's not something that's going to happen overnight, where we live in this world. Right now, I'm talking to you. This is the first one-on-one live in-person podcast that we've done since the pandemic. Everything else has been on Zoom. And this, Baruch Hashem, thank you so much for joining me in this and being the first one to break that.
Happy to be the first.
And I'm adjusting because I usually have my notes set up in a way that it's very easy. Now we're talking here and it's more of a conversation. But at the same time, it's taking time for me to adjust, and I'm expecting it to happen like that, but it's not easy. And I'm assuming the same thing for kids. And there's going to be kids that are going to struggle right in the beginning, whether it's a behavioral thing, whether it's a cognitive understanding of how things are working, whether it's a social area that they might have trouble adjusting to. But there are gonna be, not much to say all of them, but there are gonna be kids that are gonna struggle to adjust. And it's not something that you can expect to happen overnight, that everybody's going to be just, as they were right before the pandemic. There are going to be some areas where people need to change. I want to shift to a different area because I was talking to somebody else and I asked her, I'm not going to name any names. I told her you were coming on, and I said, what is a question that we can ask Chesky about for this particular topic? And she had a different perspective on this. She said that the younger people are these days, and my generation, our generation, we're about the same age, falls into this as well. There's an era of victimization and entitlement, wherein it's the woe is me mentality, where look at all these things that have happened to me, to my people, to my generation. You have that with a lot of kids this past year. People missed graduation last year, bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, and graduation trips. Years in Eretz Yisrael were very different this year, and probably are going to be very different coming into this coming year. How do we battle against that victimized mentality where, like, oh, this is such a terrible thing that happened. Why did this have to happen to me? That could impact their psychological well-being, and to the point where they say, well, if this is just what's happened, then I'm just going to give up, or just this is self-victimization of that the pandemic has brought on.
Right. So I think when it comes to this feeling of woe is me, I think it gets to a general rule, really just bringing it back to anxiety treatment. That's a lot of what I do, so I kind of come back to that a lot. That there's always this, I would say, dialect of two things being true at once. That we want to instill in children, yes, it's hard, right? We validate. I totally get it. I totally get why you're scared right now. And I know that you could do this. So I think that's the frame that I try to use when I'm helping parents, manage kids who have anxiety. And I think as a society, I think it's important to take that stance also. That we could validate. I don't think it's necessarily helpful to tell kids like, oh, this is nothing compared to, 80 years ago. I think that
right.
I don't think that's necessarily helpful. I think everyone in their own struggle, has a struggle. Maybe it's not the worst, thing that Klal Yisrael has ever had to endure. Maybe it's not the worst thing that individual had to ever endure. But in that moment, there is a struggle. So I think to just totally downplay it is probably unhelpful. I think to validate it is important, as long as there's that other piece also. That, yes, it's really hard, and I know that you can manage it. It may take some time, right, with some of these accommodations that we're talking about with the patients, but to instill the fact that things can get better and that you can manage this even though it's hard. There was a quote. This is not exactly the same theme, but I think it's important to mention. Someone once quoted Ramosha Weinberger from Eish Kodesh, who said that you could say Gamzu Latova for your own sorrows as much as you want, but to say Gamzu Latova to someone else could be very insensitive. Like to tell someone else, oh, I'm sure that happened for a reason, Gamzu Latova. So I think it's similar to what came to mind when you asked that question. That I think definitely for sure there could be something to the fact that maybe there's an dramatization at times of how terrible this is, and they missed out on graduations and all these experiences that they could have had if it wasn't for the pandemic, which to some degree could be true. It could be maybe an over-dramatization, but I think to validate it is also important, and to be able to allow people to understand that it's not the end of the world either, and that we sometimes have more resilience than we give ourselves credit for.
Without downplaying it by saying that other generations had it worse. Even if it's me, I had it worse.
Right. Correct.
Another area that I thought of that might be impacted is bullying and school hallways, where you didn't have those things before. Things that happen in the school hallways, in the cafeteria, outside of school. Things that didn't really happen over the last couple of year and a half or so. Those are things that might take a different turn. Now, I'm not saying it's going to be worse. I'm not saying it's going to be better, but it's possible that because of the lack of social gatherings over the last year and a half, people forgot what they were doing. People forgot maybe how to behave. It's possible that they have a new perspective and now they're going to be better. But what do you think in terms of what we can do to prepare for these outside of the classroom social issues that may come up?
Yeah, so when it comes to bullying, unfortunately, I don't think there was a break in bullying during this pandemic. Even though there weren't kids live in school together, there was plenty of cyberbullying going on, and perhaps even more cyberbullying than there was before, because kids were just on devices more. And cyberbullying is, of course, a very real issue. And I think now coming back live, those wounds that perhaps are still there from kids being victims of cyberbullying are now just gonna kind of come back to life in face-to-face situations, and probably continue on the cyberbullying level as well. So I think the most important thing when it comes to bullying is the same thing we would do, whether it was a pandemic or not a pandemic, whether it was cyber or whether it was live. And I think that's really make sure there's an awareness in the building, that things are addressed, appropriately. I think the same way we would, even if there was no pandemic.
I have one last classroom-related question, and this is for teachers in particular. I'm not sure if this is your area, but because we were not, even the kids that were in class last year, they had these naturally, or not natural, but physical reminders of where they were allowed to be, where they were not allowed to be, whether their desk had plexiglass around it, whether there's for safety reasons, wear the mask, stay in your seat, don't get out of the, and kids were kind of basically scared into behaving in a classroom. That's gone this year. You don't have that fortress for teachers to, limit talking in class or limit misbehavior in class. There probably still was misbehaving, but those things probably helped mitigate against some of those things. So for teachers out there who are going to probably also have to adjust to life back in a normal classroom, any advice on that front?
Yeah, so I think there definitely were kids, I think of a couple of kids that I work with, that even with the distancing, of the desks far apart, they were impulsive enough. They still found ways to, disrupt the class. You could still throw a paper airplane, from one side to the other, even if you're not right next to it. But I think your point is definitely true that, unfortunately, I think we see it in shul also, right? When there's social distancing, there's less talking, right?
That's right.
There's less, disruption. So I think that definitely is true, and I think teachers could, plan ahead by maybe even being, strategic about, spacing kids that they think might be causing some more classroom disruption, which they probably would do anyway.
Right.
But I think, being able to see what it was like with the more, spacing out, maybe thinking of creative ways to recreate that without having plexiglass and masks, might be the way to go.
I was thinking about a possibility of as a punishment, you have to now wear a mask.
Right.
I don't know if that's, that's legal.
Yeah,
or whatever,
I'm not sure. I'm not sure about ACS getting involved and something like that. But no, but I think there's truth to the fact. I don't know if there's research on this. I doubt there is, but I've just noticed anecdotally that when people wear masks, and I see this when I give group therapy to kids, there's a little bit more of a comfort sometimes to speak in public. It's almost like you're hiding.
Right.
And there's a certain again, not for everyone, but I've definitely seen it, that there's a certain comfort level that is increased when you're hiding behind the mask or behind the plexiglass. So I think it's not only about behavior and classroom management issues that, might get harder now that kids are closer, but I think even from a anxiety perspective, I think kids are more exposed to some degree.
All right, so no offense to the teachers out there, but the vast majority of my audience is probably not teachers.
Mm-hmm.
Some of them probably are, but I'm guessing most of them aren't. But more of them are parents.
Mm-hmm.
So for the parents out there, if you can give a kind of a wrap up understanding of what, now that we're only a few weeks away from the start of the school year. I know it's crazy, but the summer's halfway over.
Yeah.
Rosh Hashanah is very early this year, so schools are even starting earlier than usual. But parents getting their kids ready for the school year that may be the first to go back to normal, or at some point during the school year maybe will. What should the parents be doing with their children now to prepare them for the coming school year?
Right. So I guess I'll just kind of list and highlight some of the things that I might have even mentioned already.
Sure.
But number one is modeling. Modeling a confidence that it's going to be okay. And that's hard for parents sometimes because parents are also human and also have anxiety.
Right.
So it's not so easy if parents are worried about how their kids are going to be doing this coming school year. It's hard to hide that. But as we all know, anyone who has kids or works with kids pick up on everything. So the more that we model validating that it's okay, you could label your emotion. You could say, I'm feeling, concerned right now. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling worried. And here's what we're going to do to manage it. Here's what we're going to do. So I think it's really holding both those things at once. To validate the emotion, it's okay to feel that way. And here's the plan, and here's how we could feel confident it's going to be okay. What could you do to make sure it's okay? So again, the more structure and predictability, the more routine, and that should start even days before school starts. There's always that very difficult time between, camp for a lot of kids and when school starts. So I usually recommend take a couple of days before school starts, ideally to not have the vacation go until the day before school. Take a couple of days to start to get into that morning routine a little bit, start to get to the nighttime routine. Already create a daily structure, for the child. If you know what classes they're going to be in, try to go through with them already. Again, because anxiety breeds off of uncertainty, of the unknown, of the ambiguity. So the more kids know, not that they can know everything, but the more that they know, the less anxious that they'll be. And to, again, the patience. Kids are going to have, many kids are going to have a hard time adjusting. And we have to be able to tolerate seeing them uncomfortable, which is not easy. But if we could tolerate and give them the confidence that they'll be okay, the hope is, and most of the time, as the days go on, they get more and more acclimated, and they'll be okay.
All right. So before we let you go, is there anything else that we didn't cover here that I didn't ask you that you think is important for people to know?
So I guess my final thoughts would just be that, number one, to really recognize that even though things are getting much better, there is still anxiety out there,
right.
And we have to be mindful of that and, validate people's, concerns with all this, structure that we're talking about how to go back in a safe way that's, physically safe, socially, emotionally, academically.
So we have a recurrent segment on here. Sometimes we use it, sometimes we don't. And I figure this is a great place to use it. It's called Davar Acher. And that's when I give my guests the opportunity to talk about anything else they want to talk about, not necessarily in the realm of what we were talking about today, but anything that you think is important for the Orthodox world, for the Frum world to know. So if you have anything that you want to share with us, now's the perfect time.
Okay, Davar Acher. I guess I'll give a plug for reducing the stigma of mental health conditions. I think that, I work with many from families, many from kids and adults, and I think that the more that we're able to be open about the fact that ADHD is a real thing, depression is a real thing, anxiety is a real thing, etc. And it's okay. It's okay to have these conditions, and they're treatable, and it doesn't mean that everyone in the family has them, and it's not going to ruin shidduch, resumes and things like that. So I guess just to make a plug for that these things are real conditions, and
I would guess that the problems that might have come out of not treating them are worse than the problems that would come out of admitting that you have them.
Correct, definitely. And I think that there's a lot of Torah that could be helpful, when it comes to working on one's midos, to working on one's emotions. And I think that sometimes the Torah itself could guide a person to help them change. There's during this upcoming to the month of Elul. People are thinking about how to change their midos. And I think there's also a lot of room for the science of psychology, to kick in. That sometimes, and this is what I'm sure, many of people listening, many of their rabbis would tell them also, that the Torah with psychology sometimes is the best way to heal.
Absolutely. Chesky, where can people find more about you? Are you a social media guy? I feel like you're not.
I'm not a social media guy. Okay. Correct. But I do have a website. All right. Gewirtzpsychology.com.
You want to spell that out?
Yeah, GEWIRTZ. Psychology.
Spelled like the word.
Yes, exactly. So you can find me on my website. My email address and phone number are there. I'm happy to consult. I enjoy, educating. Thank you for this opportunity.
Do you do speaking engagements also?
I do speaking engagements.
There you
go.
Do.
Yes.
We'll plug that while you're here. Always nice for that.
Yeah.
All right. Dr. Chesky Gewirtz, thank you so much for joining me this week. I truly appreciate it, and good luck.
This was a pleasure. Thank you.
My thanks to Dr. Chesky Gewirtz for taking the time to go through the possible areas of concern for students in a post-pandemic world. As the summer winds down and we get closer to the school year, those of us with school-age children should all take some time to make sure our kids are ready to return and how they should be ready for the breaking down of COVID barriers. But until next time, Kol Tov.
The Jewish Living Podcast is produced by Sreli Pikus. Our theme song is The Band by A.B. Rottenberg. Follow us on Facebook at The Jewish Living Podcast and on Twitter and Instagram at Jewish_living. You can also email the show at jewishlivingpodcast@gmail.com. The Jewish Living Podcast is recorded in conjunction with the Queen's Jewish Link.